might be?
That's a really good question, and I would say that's the number one question I get, actually, is how much everything's gonna cost. And what I always tell people is...
Today on the podcast, I have Rekha Roarty, a construction and real estate attorney in Austin, Texas. She graduated Baylor Law and currently works at Boise Saccone. She was awarded in the Austin Monthly Top Attorneys in 2020 and 2021, and just recently announced Best Lawyers to Watch in 2022. We're going to talk about construction law, the cost of an attorney, and the advice Rekha gives to her clients. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so to get to let the viewers know a little bit about Rekha, so we both grew up in Austin. Were you born here?
No, but we moved here when I was 7, and honestly, I usually just tell people I was born here. But yeah, I've lived here most of my life.
Oh, awesome. And then we actually both went to Baylor undergrad, and then a few years later you graduated from Baylor Law.
Yeah.
And so to kind of let the readers to get our viewers to know a little bit more about you, how did you get into like real estate or in construction law? Like, how did you stumble into that?
Yeah, it's actually really crazy because when I first went to law school, I wanted to do family law and work with children and things like that. So that was what my goal was. And actually my first couple years of practice, that is what I did. But while I was in law school, I started learning more about property and real estate and development, and I got pretty interested in that. And after practicing a couple years, I just decided that's really what I wanted to do. And in the Austin area in particular, there's not a lot of female attorneys who focus on construction and real estate. So I thought that'd be a fun area to get into, and that's what I've been doing ever since.
Huh. That's really interesting. So what's kind of the big differences between like construction law versus any other type of law?
I think one of the biggest differences is the amount of random things you learn on site, just because you have to go to like physical site inspections of houses and construction sites. So you learn a lot of random terms and things like that you would never learn otherwise. So like things such as, like an eave on a house and things like that, floor joists, things that never come up in regular conversations for most people.
Yeah.
Are some things that you talk about all the time. So I think the number one thing that I've learned is the terminology.
Okay, so there's just a big there's a little bit of a learning curve to the terminologies.
Yeah, for sure.
So I'm curious too, if someone, so as you know, the Austin market is really hot right now.
Oh yeah.
And so people are having a hard time buying homes.
For sure.
So a lot of times people are buying new construction homes and waiting 6 to 12, however long for them to get built. And I'm curious from your perspective if there's things that buyers should look for in the contract or be wary of, or things to think about when they're purchasing a contract or buying a home that's going to be built in 6 to 12 months.
Yeah, so that's a really good question. The number one thing is don't think that those timelines are set in stone, because you're right. All of those contracts are going to say we're going to build it in 6 to 12 months. That almost never actually happens, though. It's not at all unusual for the timeline to get delayed. So that's one thing a buyer should make sure they're paying attention to when they're signing the contract, is realizing that the language in the contract inevitably will say that there could be a reason to extend the time frame. And so buyers who are relying on that completion date should probably still make sure they have housing for a little bit longer than how long they think the house will take to be made, because that's definitely the number one thing I'm seeing with people, is that they're like, oh, well, they said the house would be done in 6 to 12 months, so I had my lease end in 6 months. No, don't do that. Make sure you have as much time built in as possible. The other thing is, there is no harm at all in having an attorney walk through the contract with you before you sign it. And in fact, that's something that a builder should allow you to do if you ask for one extra day or so to review it with an attorney. And having that attorney walk through the contract with you, it might cost you a couple $100 to get someone to sit there and walk it through with you, but it's totally worth it, because there are going to be traps. And the Texas Association of Builders contract is the one that most builders will use for new builds. That is very heavily favored towards the builder. So having an attorney walk through that with you and let you know what you might be getting yourself into, 100% worth the few $100s to have that review done.
What kind of traps, I don't know if you've had any past experience with kind of things that people might see, or traps or perceived traps?
Yeah. So one of the big ones too that we're seeing a lot in Austin with how hot the market is that home prices in the last 12 months have jumped crazily. Things that were previously selling for $400 are now selling for $600 or $700.
Yeah.
Places that were normally $700 are now for $1 million plus. So obviously builders who signed contracts a year ago are now having a bit of seller's remorse, thinking oh my goodness, I could have sold this for $300,000 more than what I'm doing now. So most builder contracts actually have a clause that a builder can terminate for convenience, basically.
Oh, okay.
And all they need to do is refund you your earnest money. And they just have to be like, well, you just kind of annoyed me, so I decided to terminate the contract. And I've seen that happen. And people are like, how can they do that? They can, unfortunately. The law is favored towards them, and their contracts that they themselves write are, of course, going to be favored towards them. So a lot of times, those loopholes are written in there where all they need to do is refund you your earnest money you've already paid, any other funds you've already paid, and maybe, like a $100 or $200 extra fee. But that's the number one thing that I've seen affecting people in the current market is builders now trying to get out of these contracts they signed a year or so ago in order to take advantage of these higher prices.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that.
It's crazy.
Because that pretty much says that, like, the builder can get out of the contract for, like, any reason, but even the buyer doesn't even have that option.
Correct. And a lot of times, in fact, it'll say if the buyer terminates the contract for convenience, they forfeit their earnest money.
Yeah.
So the $20,000, $30,000 deposit or more, sometimes people put down a $100,000 deposit, that could be forfeited if they try to walk away and they don't really have a good cause to do so.
It's only a one-way street.
Yeah, it's it's really unfair to buyers in this market. Really unfair.
Okay. Well, that's good to know for some of our buyers.
Yeah.
And kind of speaking kind of like to your practice and about like construction law, like what are the type of like people that you represent mainly?
Yeah, so we actually kind of run the gamut. We'll do both sides. Sometimes I represent builders, sometimes I represent buyers, sometimes I represent homeowners, sometimes I represent sellers. So a little bit of everything. I would say the majority of my clients tend to be homeowners who are experiencing residential construction issues, a lot of times in brand new construction. One thing people should also be aware of is they can take advantage of the laws regarding construction even if they were just doing a remodel. It doesn't have to be a from scratch piece of construction, but even remodel construction we've had issues with.
Really? What type of things, like you can't, like the city's not allowing you to build something, or what kind of things?
Yeah, well, sometimes that is permits are definitely something that's super difficult to get. So yeah, sometimes permits will slow that down. But another thing is too, with how popular construction is in the Austin area right now, builders are in short supply. So most builders have tons and tons of people just, knocking down their door, trying to get them to sign up with them and, build something for them. So some of these builders are kind of rushing the current work they have. So something that should take, 4 to 5 weeks, a builder's like, I have all these projects in my pipeline. I'm just going to grind through this and get it done in 3 weeks. Not all builders are doing that, of course. There's some that, of course, take a lot of pride and do great work. But some of them are rushing through it. And because of that, there's shoddy workmanship and the projects aren't as great as they should be. So when the customer moves into the house after the remodel is done or the brand new construction, after they live in it for a little while, they'll notice things wrong because the job was rushed.
I say it was rushed. They didn't do a good job.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's when they might reach out. That's when they might reach out to you.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, fair enough. One of the things I'm curious too is for people that are wanting to get in construction law, if you have any kind of advice for them about like if they should go to a certain college, or like if there's a certain type of experience, or like who you think are the type of people to be a good fit for being a construction attorney?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So one of the, I mentioned earlier that I used to do family law, and one of the things that I kind of wanted to get away from when I stopped doing family law was I thought family law was very emotional and very heart-wrenching, and it definitely is. It's definitely, when you deal with like people's children, it definitely is. But I thought I would 100% be getting away with that by doing construction. But it is still a very personal process because a lot of times you're dealing with someone's home, and that's like a very sacred place to someone. So you do have to be very, very conscientious when you're dealing with those situations to make sure that you're treating it very sensitively, because this is someone's home, this is where they live. If they have a problem with the construction of their home, they're seeing it every single day, multiple times a day. So I think someone who is able to treat those situations sensitively and be very empathetic to what those people are going to, that's a good person to go into construction litigation. And someone who also can sit there and read every single word of a 30-page contract and have the patience to deal with that. So someone who's patient and empathetic, those are two very big qualities I think people should have to go into construction litigation. And just someone who's willing to fight for their client.
And do you have any advice in terms of, like, say you just got you just passed the bar, like how do you go about, like, if you say like I want to do construction law, like what are kind of the steps that you recommend them taking to, whether it's just like, I don't know, applying on Indeed, or do you have suggestions like for them to get experience?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So first, lawyers in the Austin area can join what we call the Austin Bar Association's construction section, and every single construction lawyer in the Austin area is in that. So that's the number one way to network and meet new people. And in non-COVID times, we have monthly lunches so everyone can meet up and talk. And usually there will be a lawyer who makes a presentation during that lunch. So you'll learn something there, but you also get to meet people. So that's my number one piece of advice for people in Austin who want to get into the construction law industry, is to join that section of the Austin Bar. And so that's a great way to meet people. As far as jobs, meeting people at the networking events is, I think word of mouth is one of the ways that the jobs are passed along, but also I think I see Indeed and LinkedIn postings quite often. So those are two good resources.
Okay, it's good to know. 'Cause I know, yeah, because you were able to make the transition seem pretty seamlessly. Some of that, I'm sure that'll help a few of our viewers.
Yeah.
Now, one of the things, as you probably know, is that like attorneys are they're not cheap. They're expensive,
Yeah.
and I think it definitely scares people away.
Definitely.
From like reaching out to an attorney. And I'm curious if you can get help, like people that are thinking about getting an attorney, like from a cost perspective, like how, because sometimes it's scary, like how much are they going to pay? Can you kind of give like your insight in terms of like the cost, in terms of like what would one expect to pay like an attorney, like how much that might be?
That's a really good question, and I would say that's the number one question I get, actually, is how much everything's going to cost. And what I always tell people is you can't know, because most attorneys bill by the hour, and you can't tell at the beginning of a project how long that case is going to take, because it could be something that's resolved pretty quickly, and it could take 2-3 years, especially if it goes through a final trial. At a minimum, that'll probably take 3 years. So it's hard to tell, but I think one thing I would tell people is that, especially at the onset of a project, such as signing the contract, stages like that, the money you would invest in having an attorney review your contracts and help you put that together, or at least know what you're getting into, is well worth it, because that will be extremely cheap compared to the money you might have to spend on the back end to fix a problem later. And that's a long way of saying basically it's a cheaper fix to address an issue before the issue becomes an issue than it is to have to correct it after there's already a problem. So I definitely think people at the onset, when they're signing a contract or getting into a purchase, should not be afraid to spend the money at that part, to just have it reviewed and know their rights and know what they're getting themselves into, because that generally should only be a few $100s to have a contract review. If you're going to get into deep litigation, that can easily get into the hundreds of thousands of dollars, definitely. So I think it's just a conversation you need to have with your attorney at the onset about where they could see those fees going, because it's going to vary from case to case. But at least an initial doc review, anytime anyone signs pretty much any contract, they should spend the money to sit down with an attorney and go through it, because that's going to be cheaper than it would be if they had a problem later.
Okay, so the kind of the two takeaways I got was, one is to really find out is you just have to talk with the attorney and kind of just ask them the questions of, like, ask them to do a review of the case, and then they can kind of give you, okay, this is where I think the direction of like what it might cost and how long it might take.
Yeah, exactly.
So and then the other thing, a big thing you mentioned as well, it's better to spend money on the front end to make sure the contract is written well and written in the way that like both parties see fit, rather than waiting later and we have a problem and then you're just having to spend, it's just a lot more problems later.
Exactly. And I think the other thing too, some people get turned off by different rates of attorneys. So usually attorneys who've been licensed less will have a lower hourly rate, and attorneys who've been licensed longer have a higher hourly rate, just because of the breadth of experience. I think sometimes people get a little shy when they see those fees, and they're like, well, that guy's charging, $500 an hour, and that other person's charging $200 an hour. I'm going to use the $200 an hour person because, they're going to be cheaper for me. And that may be true. And there's plenty of attorneys who are new and have lower billing rates who are great attorneys. But the dollar amount per hour is not a pride thing. It's a experience thing. And so something that might take the lower fee attorney 3-4 hours to take, a lot of times the higher fee attorney might take them like 1 hour. So that's just another thing people should consider, is that it might not actually be cheaper to hire someone who has a lower rate.
Okay. So it's good that you brought that up, because I was curious as to how does like someone go about like choosing an attorney? Like what are, because like like you said, some of the things I might look at is like their cost, because I mean, like you said, the more they charge, there's a good chance they have more experience. But like, say if you're looking for a construction attorney, what are kind of like good things to do or check before like choosing one?
The number one thing I tell people is ask your friends, like ask your people who you physically know and who you trust if they've ever had to use an attorney for this type of issue, and or if they know someone who's used an attorney, and get a personal referral that way, because that's I think the most comforting experience people can have is if their attorney they're hiring is either someone who they know has been used by someone who they know, or someone who a friend of a friend has used, someone who basically there's a tangible connection where you can be like, okay, well, yeah, I know that person is good because I know the work they did and I know someone who did it. That's a really good way. But a lot of times, especially with construction, that's more of a niche issue, so it might be a little bit harder to find someone that way. So I would say the other way to do it is to reach out to your networks and ask, who do you guys know for this? Google is definitely a good way to look up attorneys. You're going to find attorneys, but everyone should just remember, those first few names that pop up, those are people who paid the money to have themselves come up. It doesn't necessarily mean they're the greatest ones. But I would say definitely checking out people's reviews online. Sometimes, of course, there can always be, trolls who go and post like mean reviews, but there's a website called Avvo, AVVO. Every single attorney, avvo.com, every single attorney in the U.S. automatically has a page on there once they're licensed, and you can see client reviews on there, and that's a good place to look for reviews to see how attorneys are getting reviews. I don't think Yelp is a good source, because I've learned that they tend to bury a lot of 5-star reviews for people.
I'm aware of that.
So Yelp, I think, pretty much discard that. That website's crazy. Google reviews, I think, tend to be a little more accurate. I think one thing to be aware of, though, is that, of course, anyone who has a Google account can leave it. So you never know if it's a real accurate review. It's just good to look at those reviews and just see what other people are posting and just see what people are saying. I think if you read the reviews, you can kind of weed out the trolls from the real ones.
So the number one tip is see if someone you know has used a realtor. I mean, not a realtor, but a attorney before.
Yeah.
And if you can't do that, then Google reviews, or as you mentioned, like reviews on Avvo would be a good resource.
Yeah.
Okay. One of the things I'm curious too is, from your perspective, I say if I reach out to you and I have a legal issue, how do I be like the best client so that I can kind of get the most out of you and have like the best experience?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I wish all clients would ask that, because that's I think the number one thing I always tell clients is that one of the things you can do to make my life easier and to make their life easier is to give as much information as you can. So what I always do with my clients is I tell them, if there's anything you think is remotely relevant, I'll set up a Dropbox or other file share system, and you put everything that you think I need to know in there. It's easier for me to look at all that information and weed out what we don't need than for me to have to weed out or have to guess what exists that I'm not seeing. So clients should remember that everything that's spoken with their attorney is privileged. There's very, very few exceptions, such as, if you're saying that you plan to go harm someone the very next day, then we are obligated to report that, of course. But even if you think it's something bad that's going to maybe portray you in a bad light, show it to your attorney, because you'd rather your attorney see that at the beginning than learn about it, during a deposition or in court. You want them to know what the issues are beforehand so they can prepare for how to deal with it if needed. So share as much information as possible. Don't hold things back. This is not a time to be, concerned about what your image might be like or anything like that. Share as much as you can.
Okay, yeah, because
no judgment.
Yeah, because I can see from your perspective is you need to get as much information so you can have like a big picture of like what happened and kind of how best to take the next steps. Because I'm sure from your perspective, it sometimes can be really difficult to understand like the whole situation. Yeah,
exactly, and especially in residential construction, for both the homeowner and the builder. If I'm representing the builder, sometimes they don't want to admit that they failed an inspection and had to redo it, or that, they used a cheaper material than what they said they were going to use. I'm going to find that information out anyway. You might as well tell it to me on the front end so I can figure it out how we're going to handle that in your case. Similarly with homeowners, they might, they had some new construction and the builder told them, hey, like, don't move back into your house for another day or two. And they moved back into their house right away. And that caused them issues. Well, they need to tell me up front. They told me not to be in the house for 48 hours and I came back in after 24 hours. Tell me that so we can figure out how to deal with it rather than being surprised by it later.
Okay, so don't let your pride get in the way of like sharing
Exactly.
things.
Yeah. And it's a no judgment zone. Like if your attorney's there to help you, they're not going to care. And I guarantee you they've heard something worse. So
Okay, that's good to know.
Yeah.
I'm curious too if there's like mistakes that you see clients like make over and over again that are like really common and things to kind of like avoid in general.
Avoid trying to become a Google scholar is what I tell my clients a lot. And what I mean by that is like I have a lot of clients who will, they obviously are really passionate about their own cases and want to learn about it, but they'll go online and they'll be like, well, I read this article about this guy on Florida and he posted on Reddit and said that he did this and this and this and then he got this result. I'm like, that's, it's not.
It's just hearsay.
Yeah, exactly. And on top of that, there's different rules that apply in different states. And then, sometimes they'll see something that's federal law, but we're under state law. So it's like, the reason you're paying for your attorney is because your attorney sat through 3 years of law school, took the bar exam, and learned all this stuff in an organized manner, not from, reviewing message boards online.
Yeah.
So that's, I think, the one thing I tell clients, they don't want to step on their own toes and get in their own way by trying to think they know more than they do, by doing a bunch of online research. I definitely encourage people to do their own research too, but I think there's a common saying for doctors that's like, don't confuse your Google search with my medical degree. I would say the same thing applies with lawyers.
I say, that's funny you mentioned that. I've had people like,
I'm sure the realtors do it all the time too.
Yeah, they're like, it's like someone did this in a different state, and I'm like, well, there's a problem right there.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. Or they're like, well, I saw this on, on Facebook, someone said this. I'm like, yeah, but, half the time you don't even know if those people are telling the truth. So, yeah.
One of the things too, I think that we've talked about too is like the cost of like going through litigation, and like if it's like, is it worth like trying to like in mediation, is it worth kind of like trying to see if you can have things solved, or is it like worth going through litigation for like serving cases? Do you have like any like position on that?
Yeah, so I always think first in the Austin area, if you're in the Austin area, your case is probably going to be in Travis County 90% of the time, but sometimes you have Williamson County and sometimes you have Hayes County. Travis County actually requires, if you file a lawsuit, that you mediate before going to a final trial. Williamson and Hayes County will also require that if you ask for it.
Okay.
So if you file a lawsuit, you 99% of the time are going to have to go to mediation anyway. So I definitely, in that sense, I wouldn't only recommend mediation. I would just say we pretty much have to do it whether or not we want it. But what I would also tell people is that if you have the ability to settle at mediation and know what you're getting into, I think you should do that most of the time, because the uncertainty of going to trial where you're in front of either a judge or a jury, and the judge or the jury, depending if you have a jury trial or a bench trial is what we call if it's just a judge there, they have 100% of the control in what the decision is. You have no control over that. At mediation, a mediated settlement agreement is something that both sides agree to and sign saying they agree to it. So you have a little bit more control over what you're agreeing to, but also you have some creativity in what you can do. You might be able to do things that a judge or a jury cannot order. So it's definitely, it's of course always a case-by-case basis. There might be some situations where it's like, yeah, you definitely need to go to trial for this. But I would say a lot of times if you can settle, it's definitely a good option. It takes away the uncertainty of litigation, and it takes away a lot of the time and effort that goes into that.
Yeah, I'm sure there's a significant cost to going to litigation.
Yes.
And then the outcome is probably quite a bit more uncertain, and it's more of like it either goes to one side or the other side.
Exactly.
Not necessarily, there's no like down the middle like you would have maybe through mediation.
Exactly, yeah. A lot of times it's not going to be a piecemeal, like, okay, you get this. It'll be a lot more one-sided. So it's either, a lot of times it might be either all or nothing.
Okay, an all or nothing thing. Okay. So I'm curious too, we've kind of talked about this a little bit. So say I have like some type of legal problem, when should I like reach out to an attorney? Like when is like the best time?
Sooner rather than later. I would say, hey, the second you even think there might be a problem, go ahead and reach out at that point. The earlier you have someone involved, the better. Okay.
So just as soon
Don't
as you
hesitate.
Yeah, as soon as if you're thinking about an attorney, you should just go do it.
Yes, yeah, exactly. And I mean, I've had people come to my office and tell me something that's going on, and I tell them, like, look, there's nothing we can do right now. Your case, the term that they use in courts is ripe, whether or not your case is ripe for litigation. And I've told people, this might not be ripe, but then we, at least we know how to handle it before it gets to that stage, and we can pre-plan and have some advance notice.
Okay. Well, to kind of help our viewers kind of know a little bit more about you, I'm going to ask you a few like rapid fire questions, kind of like let people know a little bit more about you as a person. I'm curious, like, is there anything like obscure that you love to do? And I'll give you kind of an example of like for me. Have you ever seen the show like Xena, the Warrior Princess?
Yeah.
So she has like a chakram, and something I like to do for fun, or something I bought, is one of those like that chakram ring. And like throw it around like in the woods, or like throw it at trees just for fun as like an activity. Is there any kind of activity that's kind of obscure that you like doing?
I don't know if it's obscure, but one thing that I've started liking to do a lot is we have some trails near our house, and my son is 1.5 years and is just now getting to the point where he can kind of walk around a little bit stably. So we love going on those trails and just seeing random things around there. And we've learned a lot about nature. We live near the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center, so learning about plants and things like that is something I've gotten really into.
I'm just curious. Are you big into gardening by any chance?
Only recently.
Okay.
Mainly, I think a large part of that is quarantine and like being at home. It's like, what can I do at home? Guess work in my backyard. So learned a lot about that, and I think when you start doing gardening stuff, you just are always thinking like, oh, there's one other thing I want to do. I think I'm out there weeding almost every day because we back up by a green belt, so we have a lot. But,
that's awesome. Yeah, I think it's really comforting to like get to use your hands and do some kind of like physical labor, because just like especially like nowadays, like because of COVID, like we're all in front of computer screens all day. So it's nice to kind of get some like physical activity of some kind.
Yeah, exactly.
Another thing I was going to ask is, like, since you're an attorney, you probably do a lot of reading and writing just in general. And I'm wondering if there's any books that you've ever gifted to other people, or if people have gifted to you.
Yeah, so one of my former law professors, Gerald Powell, he recently wrote a book called The Sporting House Murders, and he, of course, Baylor law professor. He actually is from Waco, like born and brought up there. So his story is actually based in Waco in the 1800s. So it's kind of cool. It's like very like historical about Waco, and it's one of the main characters is a Baylor University attendee at the time. So that's a really good book, I think, for people, because it talks a lot about, it's written by a law professor, so the law references in it are real. Yeah. So it's pretty cool, but it's also a fun read because it's a novel and not, like an academic
it's
text.
not like you're reading like, I don't know, kind of like constructional law legal aspects. It's like an actual like, it's a real story, but it's like has like kind of like novel elements.
Yeah.
Okay. And kind of the last of the rapid fire questions is like, what's the favorite gift or service that you've gifted yourself that's like under $100?
My favorite gift or service, I think I like getting pedicures.
Okay.
That's a fun one. And,
okay, so pedicures are for your feet.
For your feet, yeah.
Okay.
And so the reason being too is because if you're just like chilling and relaxing, you can still. One of my ways is to like look on my phone. Like I love even though I'm not in the target audience for it, I love like TikTok and like those funny videos and stuff on there. So if they're working on your feet, you can still use your hands and you can like browse on your phone, all the social media stuff. So that's my favorite chill activity.
Okay, nice.
Yeah.
And so the last thing is, what's the best way for people to get in contact with you if they want to reach out to you and learn more about your services? Yeah,
definitely email is the number one way. I think sometimes I'm a little too fast to respond to emails, but that's my number one way. And my email is rroarty@bclawtx.com.
Okay, we'll include that in the show notes.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, so email is the number one way.
Okay. You don't have any like Facebook or Instagram or anything like that for people that reach out to you?
I do. I have an Instagram for my lawyer services, and it's Lawyer Rekha is the handle.
Okay.
And then I also have a TikTok, but I don't think anyone's ever reached out to me on there. Lawyer Rekha is the name on the TikTok as well.
Okay. Well, with that, we'll wrap things up. I was really glad having you here.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. This was great.
Okay.